Peace be with you all. Welcome to this evening's webinar entitled From Nakba to Now, 78 Years of Ethnic Cleansing, Dispossession and Resistance, hosted by the Palestinian Return Center. I'm your host, Betul Sabeti. It's only right that I start off by sending our heartfelt greetings of dignity to the steadfast and resistant people of Palestine, starting from Jerusalem, the origin, to Gaza, to the West Bank, to the Palestinians of 1948, and to all the refugees who are praying for the right to return. It is your steadfast resistance that will bring about liberation, may I say, not only for the Palestinian struggle, but it will bring about humanity's right to not exceed the boundaries of human rights. The biggest shame throughout humanity to have occurred is the Nakba in Palestine. It was and is the mother of all crimes. The original shame was in the meeting of the interests of the Zionists and the imperialists, and the whole world superpowers conspired and turned their backs on Palestine as the settler colonial state of Israel was erected on the ruins of the ethnically cleansed Palestinian towns and villages. We were looking at over 50% of those villages were ethnically cleansed. It is a crime above which there is no other that saw the displacement and uprooting of over 800,000 Palestinians from their land who became refugees. The unique nature of this oppression is that it is ongoing. The Nakba continues. Only a serious and large-scale movement can erase this biggest shame to have occurred. In the case that there is no right to return, this shame in the conscience of the world will remain. In the case there is no right to return, human values will be reduced to nothing. They will be stripped of their weight entirely. And this is because the temporary and the narrow interests of the world powers to create a state at the detriment of another people will have occurred at the complete expense of principles and values. Tonight's webinar is organized by the Palestinian Return Center, founded in London in 1996. The PRC is an independent, non-partisan organization dedicated to the promotion and protection of Palestinian rights, foremost among them the right of return. For nearly 30 years, we have conducted research, advocacy, and awareness raising on the plight of Palestinian refugees. And in 2015, we were granted special consultative status at the United Nations. The right of return is not a political slogan, it is an inalienable right enshrined in international law, and it is what brings us here tonight. Our webinar tonight is titled From Nakba to Now, 78 Years of Ethnic Cleansing, Dispossession and Resistance. Over the next hour or so, we will hear from two distinguished speakers who will connect the history of 1948 to the present, to Gaza, to the West Bank, and to what the world must do in response. Before we start our webinar, please share tonight's stream widely with your networks. You can submit your questions for our speakers on the YouTube channel and Facebook at any time during the evening, and we will address as many as we can during our Q&A. So without further ado, our first speaker tonight is Professor Muhannad Ayyash. Professor Ayyash was born and raised in Silwan, a neighborhood in occupied Jerusalem that has itself become a front line of dispossession and erasure. He left Palestine to pursue his education and his scholarship, and has spent his career doing what so few academics dare to do, telling the truth about what happened in Nakba in 1948 and what is still happening today. He is the author of A Hermeneutics of Violence 2019, and he is a professor of sociology at Mount Royal University in Canada. Please welcome Professor Muhannad Ayyash. Great to have you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I want to thank the Palestinian Return Center for inviting me and for hosting this webinar. A pleasure also to share it with Kamel. Really looking forward to the discussion, and for everyone, of course, who's listening in the UK and beyond. First and foremost, I want to start by emphasizing that the Nakba that happened in 1948 is not just some isolated historical event that happened once in the past. It's not just one-off war that happened at some point in the past and we're trying to commemorate it. It's a major event, no question about it, obviously, but it is an event that shows something that has been happening already in Palestine at that point for decades, and something what we would call it a structure of violence that has been ongoing since then. So that's why in Arabic we say it's the ongoing Nakba. It hasn't stopped. It didn't start in 1948 and it hasn't stopped since then. So that underlying structure of violence is what people need to always remain focused on, because that is the root cause of all the violence that you have witnessed in Palestine over the last 120 odd years. And I would say it's the underlying cause behind a lot of the violence you see in the region as a whole, including just most recently the war on Iran and the ongoing war on Iran and Lebanon. This is a structure of violence that in my new book I kind of refer to. I use the word lordship to describe it. So what is this? What is this underlying structure of violence that gave rise to the event that we call the Nakba in 1948 and continues to give rise to more violence ever since then? Essentially, what I mean by lordship is that I find it is the best way to describe what is the sort of core of the Zionist project. The Zionist project comes into Palestine. People can debate the exact date. You can't find like an exact day and time where this arrives, but late in 19th century, early 20th century, for sure. By then, the early 20th century, by the time the British come in, Zionism is now got a foothold in Palestine, and its project is being unleashed on the Palestinians from the early parts of the 20th century. So Zionism comes in and they try to establish a state that is operating on this idea of lordship. They're trying to establish the Israeli Jewish subject as lord and master of the land. That means that the Palestinian indigenous inhabitants that have lived in Palestine on these lands for centuries and centuries will have to be removed from their land in order for this new identity to come in, this new people to come in and establish themselves as lords and masters of the land and the people on the land. There was no other way for the Zionist project to accomplish its goal of creating lordship over Palestine. It meant it was a zero-sum game in Zionism from the beginning. It had to, remove the Palestinian inhabitants by any means necessary. That means genocide, ethnic cleansing, dispossession, all the different techniques and tactics of what we would call in the literature, settler colonial structure of genocide. I know that's a mouthful, but it's not just one kind of violence that helps settler colonial powers achieve their goals of getting rid of the indigenous inhabitants. It's multiple forms of violence, right? It involves mass killings, it involves imprisonment, torture, changing laws around land ownership, stealing land, oppressing the indigenous population, restricting them to small chunks of land where they live under the total surveillance of the settler colonial state, and so on and so forth, right? Like apartheid itself, by the way, it's not apartheid. I've always argued this. It's not a good description of what Israel and Zionism is. It is what they do to try to achieve their ultimate goal, which is complete settler colonial domination and lordship over the entirety of the land from the river to the sea. So all of these are forms of violence that appear within that kind of structure of lordship, of trying to establish themselves as lords and masters of the land. So that starts from the beginning. It's not like they came and we'll live with these Palestinians and we'll share the lands with them, or they just came and say, we want to be refugees and live with you all and escape European anti-Semitism. No, they came in from the very beginning and said, we are your masters and lords, and you're going to have to go away. We are the new masters and lords of this land, and there's no negotiation with you. You're going to have to cease to exist in order for us to exist as we would like to exist as masters and lords. That's essentially the very first message Zionists send to the Palestinian population from day one, and a message that they have not stopped sending to the Palestinians since then, which, by the way, means that by definition, Zionism and Israel is always the aggressor. So an aggressor cannot act in self-defense. They're the aggressor. They're the ones who are starting the violence. They're the ones who are the reason, the root cause of the violence. So they cannot, by definition, ever actually act in self-defense, which is why it's ridiculous when Israel claims self-defense, not just by sort of conventional standards of how that means, but I would say by logic and reason of who is the actual aggressor in this context. It is always Zionism and Israel by definition, because they're the ones coming in and saying what exists here will no longer exist, and we're going to use violence to erase the existence of the Palestinians and establish ourselves as masters and lords. So anyway, that's essentially what drives that kind of Zionist project from the beginning, like I said, and they start to do it from the beginning. They do it in the beginning by purchasing lands here and there, but don't buy into the Zionist mythology that they purchased all the land that became Israel in 1948. This is absolute nonsense. Researchers have shown that at most, if we want to be extremely generous, we'll say that they bought 10% of what became Israel, only 10% of what became Israel in 1948. But most likely the number is closer to 5 to 7%. By the way, the reason why they were initially able to buy these lands was because the Palestinians or the owners who were not Palestinian that sold the land did not think that these Zionist organizations were buying the land to expel the Palestinian inhabitants. They thought they were just another business transaction. Some of these lands were part of business transactions for quite some time. At this point, capitalism was already brought in by the Ottomans. The Palestinians who lived on those lands didn't care too much who the owner was, as long as they got to remain on their land and live on their land and work their land. And as soon as they start to be expelled from their lands, you start to see the first signs of Palestinian resistance to the Zionist project. And this was carried out by the Fallahin, in English, the peasants. Although it's not the best word to describe it, but anyway, we'll use that for our purposes here. And these Palestinians start to say, well, hold on, this is not just some other capitalist owner. There's some kind of political project here behind these Zionist organizations. They're trying to get rid of us and establish themselves as the new, owners of the land, quote unquote. So this is not right. And this is when you start to see the first signs of Palestinian resistance to Zionist settler colonialism from the early parts of the 20th century. Of course, it takes its most sort of known full-fledged rebellion and revolt in 1936 against British imperialism and Zionist settler colonialism. At any rate, so Palestinian resistance starts from the beginning. And it starts in anti-colonial terms from the beginning and anti-racist terms from the very beginning, and saw themselves as part of the global South struggle against the Western European colonial project, as they rightfully were. At any rate, right, this kind of dynamic continues. Then it leads up to 1948, where you do have the Nakba, the massive expulsion of Palestinians, and extreme violence committed against Palestinians in order to create the state of Israel. They managed to establish it over 78% of the land of historic Palestine. But they wanted the whole thing from the beginning. Ben Gurion is famous for saying, listen, we'll get it. We'll get it all eventually, but we got to do it step by step. We can't get it all in one go. So Zionism, and he's labor, quote unquote, the left socialist Zionist, right? Like, it's not these right-wing Zionist and Israeli political parties are not introducing something new into Zionism or Israel. This discourse of greater Israel has been there from the very beginning, and they plan to establish this Jewish state over the entirety of the land from the river to the sea, where only a very small, manageable minority of Palestinians would be allowed to remain. But they would no longer be Palestinians. They would not be sovereign people. They would live under Israel as second, third, fourth class citizens, and they would only make up 5 to 10 to maybe 15% of Israel. That was kind of the vision from the beginning, and they never got off that vision. And ever since the early parts of the 20th century, through the Nakba, through 67, through the Intifada, through the peace process, so-called peace process, and on and on, Israel has never wavered from its ultimate goal of establishing that sort of exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty, this lordship over the entirety of the land and the people from the river to the sea. And to sort of jump this forward to today, the Israeli government saw October 2023 as an opportunity, a historic opportunity, an opening that doesn't come about very often, where they can finally implement their grand desires and their grand plans for Palestine. And we saw, an attempt of unleashing with full force a genocidal military campaign against the Palestinians in Gaza, with one goal in mind that is still theirs to this day, which is to eliminate Palestinian existence as a sovereign people in Gaza. And they unleashed, as we all know, some of the most brutal violence in the history of humankind over the last 2.5 years in order to achieve that goal. And at the same time, they accelerated similar kinds of violences. They were unleashed to the same level in places like Jenin refugee camp. But overall, in the West Bank, they didn't attack the entirety of the West Bank like they attacked Gaza. They knew they couldn't. Trust me, if they could, they would. It is in their desires and plans to do that one day. But they intensified settler violence and state violence. The two, by the way, are the same thing. I can get into that more if people are interested, but they are the same thing. And we've known they're the same thing for a long time. Academics, both, by the way, Israeli, some Israeli academics as well as Palestinian academics. At any rate, so they've unleashed that kind of violence on Palestinians in the West Bank, and the ultimate goal is to make life unlivable for the Palestinians there, continue to squeeze them, continue to isolate them into smaller and smaller pockets, isolated from each other, so that they can no longer recreate themselves as a collective, as a people, as a unified people in a unified struggle against Israeli settler colonialism. And that is still their goal. That is still the plan that is being operationalized in both Gaza and the West Bank, trying to essentially squeeze Palestinians out of their lands so that it all becomes Israel. And we know that it won't stop there. We know what their plans are for southern Lebanon. They're already talking about, greater Israel being extended there, southern Syria. So what I've argued in my book essentially is that when this kind of way of thinking, a worldview and practice of lordship takes hold in a settler colonial society and state, it can't be stopped from within. It takes a dynamic of its own. Like it keeps running on its own, and it keeps accelerating. With every act of settler colonial conquest, it begets the next one. They can't stop. They will not be able to stop. And the level of the dehumanization of Palestinians in particular, but Arabs in general, is so severe, so extreme in mainstream Israeli society and state. This is not just a problem of a few politicians. I know, mainstream politicians and commentators and media personalities in the UK and Canada and the US just want to say, oh, it's Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu is half as bad as they are. That kind of way of thinking. But nothing, or a few bad settlers. It's across the board, across the political spectrum in Israel, that there's a huge level of dehumanization of Palestinians and Arabs in general, and the notion that Israel is has the right to do anything it wants to any of those people with no repercussions and no consequences. They've also removed all moral inhibitions from unleashing, brutal mass extermination, genocidal violence against Palestinians and Arabs in general. This is also part of what I argue in my book is part of lordship. Let me just kind of explain this a little bit more here. I know I have about 5 minutes left. One of the reasons I use lordship, there's a few reasons, but one of the reasons is, it's a way of doing, of thinking about the world where people start to put themselves in positions that the majority of human societies across history have only attributed to God or the realm of the gods, how far back you want to go in history, where they have this kind of indivisible, absolute, omnipresent kind of power where they get to decide on who and what lives and what dies with no consequences for them. Usually that kind of power, human societies only attribute to a divine entity, not to people. But in the colonial age, it's not just Zionism; it's in all the Western European empires, in fact, that you start to see the sort of this process where they start to put themselves in the position of gods. And they get to decide on who lives and who dies, what can exist and what shouldn't exist. And they have no moral inhibitions in carrying out those violences to establish those ideals. And this is where Israel is. It's the best description of what Israel does. And if you watch them, I mean, go see how they brag on social media about how they killed children and committed rape and used dogs to rape people, and they're laughing. You know, there's a lot of attention right now to this story because the New York Times published it, so now it deserves attention. When the Palestinians talk about it, it doesn't deserve attention anyway. But if you read those stories, what a lot of people are not focused on is how much they're describing in these horrific, you know, beyond the imagination of any decent human being to even imagine seeing, let alone doing, is how much they're laughing while they're doing it. And you see that kind of glee that they have when they commit these kinds of violences. This tells you there are zero moral inhibitions left. There's nothing. There's nothing that can hold them back internally. You know, they're not going to stop in Palestine. They're not going to stop in Lebanon. They're not going to stop in Syria. The more they keep getting away with this, the more they're going to keep expanding it. And the more we're going to see wars in the region. So ultimately, the only way to really stop such a settler colonial entity, such a settler colonial violence, is outside intervention. The Palestinians have resisted Zionist settler colonialism and Israeli settler colonialism for over 100 years. We'll continue to resist it for hundreds more years if we need to. But given the power asymmetry, we can't actually defeat it on our own. And we do need people power from across the world to come to our support. And what people power needs to do across the world is to start to shift their thinking away from just symbolic support to material support. We need material support in two senses. We need material support that helps Palestinians stay on the land, allow them to materially continue to feed themselves, house themselves, get education, healthcare, and so on, and be able to withstand this Zionist Israeli onslaught. And we need material support by isolating the Israeli state. That's the only way you can put pressure on Israel. You have to materially isolate it. I'm not talking about, I'm going to put out another statement of condemnation. I know I'm preaching to people here or know what I'm talking about, but that is what is needed. It's not about statements of condemnation. It's about boycotts, sanctions, divestment of the Israeli state. This is the only way that you can start to put material pressure from the outside on the Israeli state. And so I encourage everyone to keep, and I know many probably are already on the path of BDS, but I encourage everyone here to keep pushing on that path and keep involving more and more people to join you on that path until we actually, start to see some serious economic material pressure being placed on the Israeli state. Because otherwise, we're going to continue down this road of genocide and greater regional wars, which, as you have seen now, I know that people should not want these greater regional wars because they hate seeing Iranians and Lebanese and Palestinians and Syrians getting killed. But I also know that the reality is that most people are only moved by these things when it affects them personally. So if you don't want to continue to feel economic pain on a global economy level, then you want Israel to be reined in. And it has to be reined in fully and completely. And that means the isolation of the Israeli state. So I'll end it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Ayash. Absolutely. So many important points. You've reminded us of, what makes the Nakba the biggest crime in humanity. Absolutely, it was the systemic planned nature of it by the world superpowers. Not many people realize it's not the starting point wasn't 1948. Like you said, it was at least 50 years, 5 decades of planning by the Zionist movement that was supported by the world superpowers, who essentially conspired to uproot the Palestinian people. And because this state is inherently inorganic and does not belong to the region. It needs to expand to feel stable. And this is where you brought in this idea of the Greater Israel Project. That's, I would say, being spoken of so openly today, not just by the Zionists, but by their guarantors, the United States of America. Like Trump comes out and says Israel's so thin it needs to be thickened. And I believe, that's why the past 2.5 years have been so significant, because it touched upon the last point that you made, and that is, the will to resist, the Palestinian will to resist. And the past 2.5 years have shown that the Palestinian cause, has not died despite that discrepancy in the power balance. And so the will to resist and not surrender has really proven to threaten the Israeli occupation entity more than even the material capabilities. And, thank you for reminding us also that resistance takes many forms. And whilst we should encourage the Israeli occupation entity being punished on a state level, also we must not underestimate the importance of the individual role in all of that as well, and feeling the sense of the responsibility for the cause, because it really is a one-on-one effort that culminates on a world level. So thank you for that. Our second speaker tonight brings a different but equally vital perspective, that of a Palestinian who has lived and worked in Britain for decades, who has seen the Nakba through the eyes of the diaspora, and who has dedicated his life to ensuring that the Palestinian voice is heard in the corridors of power in this country. May I add, he recently got elected within the Green Party as a councillor in the city of Birmingham in the UK. He is a British Palestinian politician, author and analyst, and one of the most prominent Palestinian voices in the United Kingdom. Please welcome Professor Kamel Hawash. Great to have you.
Thank you so much for this event. It's very important, and I hope people really connect the three stages of the Nakba itself, what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, and where things are heading. Just to illustrate how, to me personally, I felt the Nakba and felt a refugee, I will tell you what happened to me in 2017. So, yes, I brought up by parents. My parents are both from Jerusalem. Both of them were born before 1948. And they happened to be in Saudi Arabia when the 1967 war happened, but I was born in Saudi Arabia and then came to pursue my education here. But in 2017, just bringing it to that date, I was with my wife and young son, who was only 5, going back to Jerusalem, because we're both from Jerusalem. She really was born in Jerusalem. So we used to go and visit her family and try to. And when we got to the airport, it became clear they were going to give me some difficulty, Tel Aviv airport. So at one stage, I was sitting in the room that they put people in, and I looked out the window and I thought, my goodness me, that is my land out there, 5 meters away. At the end of the night, they deported me without allowing me to go onto my homeland. Nobody can understand how that feels except Palestinians. So there are people used to march from Beirut to the border, etc. But I was actually in near Jaffa, if you like, and I couldn't even walk out onto my homeland. And as I say, it's very difficult for others to understand. But how this all started was, of course, Zionism. And one of the things about Zionism, the word and the ideology, is that they say generally the term or the definition that I hear is, well, it's the right of self-determination of the Jewish people. If it stopped there, I'd have no problem. It is the next bit, the right of return, the self-determination of Jewish people in Palestine. So they chose our homeland to be the place where they had the right of self-determination. And then in 2018, so bring it to the now, they came out with the nation-state law, which said only Jews had the right of self-determination in our homeland. And that the Palestinians stroke Arabs, as they call them, and even the Druze, didn't have a right to self-determination. So these are things, just continue and illustrate what Zionism is about. And there is not a single definition of Zionism, because they say, oh, well, there are different definitions of Zionism. Not one said anything about the rights of the Palestinians. With all its troubles, and I'm going to read it out to people, the Balfour Declaration said something about us, the Palestinians. So In 1917, the Balfour Declaration or letter was issued, and it was from Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, in which he says, "I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet." Now that is important because it wasn't approved by Parliament, the British Parliament. So His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine, and that's the point I made about the definition of Zionism, a national homeland for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavor to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews. Note here, they have political status for Jews both in Palestine and in other places, in any other country. I should be grateful if you bring this to the attention of other people. So we were at least mentioned as communities, even though we were the overwhelming majority on the land in 1917. And then Britain decided to include this in. So before it went to Palestine and occupied it, and I call it an occupation, when they had the British mandate, they included this in their mandate. When in the other countries, it was the fact that people in their homeland, they just became independent in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, wherever this ended, and so on, except in Palestine. And then the Zionists came up with saying that, well, we were there 2,000 years ago. This is the chosen people. This is the land that's given to us by God. And I say to them, I'm a Muslim. I very much like visiting Mecca. I haven't been able to do it that often, but I don't think I have a right to go and live there. Why should you have a right to live in a land you don't come from anymore? For your faith, go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, and to other areas you want to go to, but you shouldn't have a right to be there. But of course, that was used and coupled with the Holocaust to justify the fact that they would come and establish, a state in our homeland. So that issue is the background to this. And if I look and try and bring it forward a bit, I wasn't born before or at the Nakba, but I will never forget in Saudi Arabia. When I was 5, 1967, my mother was crying one day. And I looked at her and I said, "Mum, why are you crying?" And she said, and I always say it as I remember it. I don't know what word she used, but I thought she said, Al-Yahud ihtallu sittak. The Jews have occupied your grandmother, because my grandmother then lived in Jericho. So that was effectively the first time I began to think about Palestine in the context of my grandmother, my family, as I was growing up, but as I grew up as well, I was a little confused between Jordan and Palestine, in the sense that we have a Jordanian passport. We had Judean passports, but I was told we came from Palestine. And in case there are any Zionists watching, when I say I was told, that's what I understood as the difference, that we actually came from there. As someone, a British who goes to Britain, who goes to Australia, becomes Australian, they still came from Britain. And so there were the things that we could think about. And then sort of coming forward, I remember going for the first time to visit my grandmother in 1969 and going through this bridge and the bus rattling because it was made of wood. And then when we got there, I remember that in Jericho, you didn't see any army. Hardly ever did you see a jeep come and just drive through and go. And then when I used to visit Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, of course, is where my family were, you didn't see a presence for settlers. Whereas if you go now, you hardly see the presence of Palestinians. It's changed so much. So that gives you a bit of a tour of where, if you like, I started my understanding of being a Palestinian. Eventually, I came to study in the UK, and then I started work. And one day I saw a stall in Birmingham in 2000 and 2002. And I thought, what is that? Why is there a Palestinian flag here? That started my interest in campaigning for Palestine. It was then that I started. As it happens, on that day, speaking in Birmingham City Council was Fadwa Barghouti, after her husband, Marwan Barghouti, had been placed in jail. She wanted to raise the issue. So anyway, I began to work on campaigning for Palestine, and then I became eventually the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is a fantastic honor, and it's one of the most important pro-Palestine solidarity organizations in the world. But I began to also understand how Palestine is looked at in Britain. So having Balfour Declaration on one side, you would have thought that because the issue of the respecting the rights of the Palestinians, at least Britain, weak though that is only on its own, would be actually pushing for the Palestinians to have their rights. None of that. I remember meeting parliamentarians. Of course, the ones we used to meet were mainly supportive. But at the end of the day, it seemed bizarre that although they claim that two states should live side by side, nobody was doing anything to make that happen until, as you know, Britain recognized Palestine last year, but there has been no real anything on the ground that has changed things. In fact, I was involved in writing a letter that went to the British consulate in East Jerusalem asking, why is it that it still says consulate when you've recognized Palestine? Shouldn't it be the embassy of Britain, and shouldn't an ambassador be there, as they did with Dr. Hussam Zumlot here? But we've had no reply, and you can imagine that they would find it really tricky in the thinking to call it an embassy. What we then witnessed in Gaza, so I'll come to that, and throughout, has been the Palestinians trying to gain their rights, to gain even a state on a smaller area after Oslo. When people Oslo, some people celebrated because they thought this would bring peace and so on, and it didn't. But you look at in 2018, again, when the Great March of Return went from Gaza, everyone knows, I think, that 80% of Palestinians in Gaza come from areas that they became refugees from, but they weren't allowed to return. Also, during this period, we heard, and it developed the issue about, first of all, there won't be a Palestinian state. Okay, what would there be? So BDS, which Mohammed mentioned, became very important and so on. What did the Israelis call it? They called it economic terror. Going to the ICC for us to gain some rights, they called legal terror. So there was nothing that the Palestinians could do that the Israelis would accept is within their rights, even though we have the right to these things, including the right to end the occupation through resistance, because they translate the word resistance into violence only, although it takes many means, and it can be seen as something that would help us to end the occupation, but it hasn't. I don't have to say much about Gaza. We all know what happened, except the fact that the demonization of the Palestinians is ongoing, and it hasn't stopped, and it will not stop. In fact, it has increased, and Israel has normalized the killing of children. You will remember that in the past, if one child was killed in the West Bank or whatever, there was an outcry for a while. Now, the fact that children get killed doesn't even get mentioned. They normalize starvation as a weapon, and they are using it wherever they need to make that happen. And even in closing refugee camps in Jenin and other places, part of it is to make it difficult for Palestinians to stay, and that they would have to leave. So that brings us to the international community. There is, of course, a complete split between the people and the governments. The people have been so supportive, and I've estimated in London alone and in Britain that since the marches started, something like 10 million people have been on them. When you average at 300,000 per demonstration, and we've had more than 30, that's a huge number, and it hasn't been seen as being maintained for a long time. They have boycotted. They have written to their MPs, but for some reason, and one has to say it has to be the influence of a lobby on politicians. We haven't even got the British government, either the previous or this one, saying there's a genocide. Whereas I am pleased that in the Green Party, that is acknowledged, that there is a genocide there, and we need to do more, but at least that has happened. We must continue with the marches. There's no doubt about that. We must pursue Parliament as well. People who got involved in direct action, which can be looked at as maybe they committed some crimes, they go to court, and is it a lesser crime than the crime of making weapons that go and kill Palestinian? And the history, what's happened over the last couple of years, and the shame on Britain of arresting elderly people just for holding a sign, when there are British people who went to fight in the Israeli army who just walked back as if nothing has happened. So we must continue with all of that. I think making it clear to politicians and those who committed war crimes that they will be punished and will be held accountable is important, and we must continue to do that. And also, what has happened over the last 3 years or 4 is the hypocrisy of the world was made clear when they said that Russia occupied Ukraine, but they don't acknowledge that Israel occupies Palestinians. We must continue to highlight that that is something that shouldn't happen. I want to finish by saying what I think when we will feel that Palestine has become free. My mother, who's in her 80s now, lives with me here in Birmingham, and she was born in Jerusalem, as I said at the beginning. While a Jewish lady from Birmingham can go to our homeland and be given citizenship and a life, my mother can't go back and do the same thing. And I believe that peace will come to the Holy Land when my mother is able to go back to Jerusalem, and then we will know that peace has come to Palestine and to the Holy Land. The Palestinians have a right to continue to resist the occupation within international law, but we can't be put in a position where there's nothing we can do that would bring freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Kamal Hawash, for taking us through essentially your life story of struggle, steadfastness, and of course, inspiration, and for ultimately going back to the point and reminding us of the root of the issue, and that it is an inherently political issue, no matter how much they've tried to turn it into a religious one. In that you reminded us of the Balfour Declaration, and that really there was a meeting point, if you will, in the interests between the Zionists and the imperialists, with the Zionists who are, hunters for sources of power that could actualize their vision of a homeland, and the imperialists knowing where best to place the Zionists to serve their own imperialist colonial interests. At the time, it was Great Britain. And for also reminding us of the nature of international law and these institutions. Even when we look at the UN that carved Palestine up like it was a piece of bread, it was literally a vehicle that was created by the victors of World War II, Churchill and Roosevelt, who got together and created this institution that could enable them to enact that hegemony globally and wherever they wanted. And also reminding us of the importance of the past 2.5 years, the most important aspect in the change in the hearts and minds that we've seen on a global level, and how the masks of deception have fallen, and how that's so important if we look at it in light of how much effort is put on mass media, the billions and trillions of dollars that get spent on these industries just to brainwash and propagandize people. All of that fell like a house of cards when the people saw the reality for what it is on the ground. So we will proceed on with a few Q&As before we close out this webinar, I think for the next 15 to 20 minutes. If I can start off with Professor Ayash, if we can get him onto the screen. One of the questions that has come through is, what does genuine liberation look like in practice for the Palestinians? And is it still possible? I don't know if we have Professor Ayash still with us. If not, I'm going to defer that question to you, Professor Kerman. I know you touched upon it towards the end.
Yeah. Look, the most important thing is equality. So nobody is calling for people to be thrown in the sea, although we hear so much extremism now from the pro-Israel side or the Israeli side. The Palestinians are very accommodating people if their rights are recognized. And this issue about, well, if all the refugees come back, then Israel no longer is a Jewish state, it doesn't matter. What matters is people should feel equality. They should feel that we lived together as Jews, Christians, and Muslims for centuries. There was no issue in any of and they can chase that back to the time when Jews had to leave Europe, or they were protected by Muslims in Europe. So I think that if equality is at the heart of this, respect for international law, we could move forward. But at the moment, Israel just does not recognize international law. There is no doubt that it's working to the law of the jungle, not international law, where it does what it wants. And unfortunately, this has coincided with the American administration, which is absolutely intent on supporting whatever Israel does, and the Palestinians do not have a presence. I mean, they don't even have an embassy or a mission in Washington, when in fact, Palestine is recognized by many other countries, and they have a mission. So I think the issue of whether is it one state or two states, to me, it's equality. But the most important thing is that the refugees have a right to return. Then we need to find a political solution with the Palestinians coming back, because they can all chase their roots. Unlike European people who've left here to go to Israel, who have absolutely no roots, the Palestinians do. They can demonstrate it. They have the land deeds. They have the family tree that they can present. So they need to get their rights, and then we can begin to move to equality. I'll just finish by saying, I wrote an article a few years ago when I said, Israel's body in the Middle East, but its heart is in Europe. And while they maintain that, they have to decide what they want. Do they want their heart to be in the Middle East, where they are with their body, or do they want to take their body with them and take it to Europe?
Thank you for that. Professor Ayash, is there anything that you would add to that question?
Well, just to say that the right of return to all the lands, every inch of it, is an absolute must. And there are a number of models, by the way, you can develop. Unlike Zionism, we don't operate on a zero-sum game. We can look after this genocide is going to take some years to be able to live next to Israelis that have committed this atrocious violence against us. But we can do it, but it will take some significant work on their part. But recall, in the initial stages of Zionism, there were Palestinian leaders, including the main Muslim leaders at the times, that said, "Come as refugees. We'll host you. We'll host you as refugees. We'll share this land with you. But you can't come in and rule over us and replace us." That we will not ever get behind. Of course, who does that? Nobody in history has ever said, "Yes, come, I'll give you everything that I have, and I'll leave, or I'll get killed and let you rule over me." This is ridiculous. So we can go back to sharing our lands with them, to that way of thinking. There, like I said, there are multiple models under which you can do that, and there's no point in kind of debating those now, because we're nowhere near that step. We're still at the step of them trying to annihilate us. So that has to be stopped first and foremost for liberation to then be achieved. And yes, it is possible, but what is needed is a major political will in the Arab world first and foremost, but across the world as well, including European states. But I point to my own backyard first and foremost, and argue that the Arab states have failed us miserably. They continue to do so today, and they're going to continue to pay the price for that, though. And how they don't see that, it remains a mystery to me.
Absolutely. I guess you've gone to the crux of the issue, and that's the Israeli occupation entity really is incapable of peace. when its strategy is one of literal annihilation, and it's proven that for the past 8 decades. Just a follow on from that, Professor Ayash, there was another question, and that is how, in the discussion that you had initially, we said that the Nakba has become multiple catastrophes, if you will. We've seen Israeli expansionism really knowing no limits. The question here is, if this Israeli occupation entity fails to expand, on the ground, we've seen the level of mass destruction, but we've seen it, incapable of hitting those key military strategic objectives that it sets out for itself. It's almost like it's proven that the only thing it really can do is kill women and children and massacre and genocide. But strategically on the ground, it is unable to make those wins. And we've seen, America throw its full weight behind the Israeli occupation entity, its full protection. Would you say that that is evidence of Israel's weakness and it potentially nearing its end, that it's almost like on life support and it cannot exist without that American support? And do you think, because you brought, the question of Iran and the war that's happening, do you think the current type of confrontation that we're seeing right now in the region is probably the most serious that it has been, since the Nakba, since 8 decades? And that's because, we're looking at serious powers with real capabilities that are now involved in this region. So whilst the onus is on the individuals, to carry out BDF, to resist in their own ways, like you mentioned, on a state level, it's so important that the Israeli occupation entity is besieged, is isolated, and is effectively punished for the genocide that it's inflicted on not just the people of Palestine, but regionally speaking.
Yeah, I mean, excellent question and a lot to unpack there. Let me start by first, one of the last things that you said is that yes, that we are in a historical moment that will have great significance and consequence for years and decades to come. Now, when you're talking about something like that, it's very difficult to predict all those consequences. I'm sure there's things that we're not even thinking about that are going to happen 10 and 20 years down the line as a result of what is happening today that are really difficult to call. So, I always say it, don't trust the words of any analyst, no matter how expert they are, in terms of I will tell you what's going to happen in 10 years. Nobody knows. But we can kind of do our best to look at underlying structures and dynamics and say, well, this is likely to happen, this is not likely to happen, that kind of thing. So let's start with this is fact. Israel has unleashed everything it has over the last 3 years. Military capabilities, economic capital, political they're spending it all. Their political capital is spent, and it stopped working, in fact, because they spent it too hard, too fast, too much. Most people are like, I see you for who you are. I'm not buying your propaganda. We just heard a report that they're increasing their money for their propaganda machinery in enormous amounts. And I will say it won't work. It's too late. People just not buying it anymore, including those who remain silent, including those who still maybe even parrot some Israeli liberal talking points. They don't believe it anymore. It's just become too obvious for the world to see what Israel really is. So they've spent all their capital, and they haven't achieved the goals that they have set out to achieve. Now, but you have to be careful here and not just fall into this way of thinking that, well, since they haven't yet, it means they never will, and this is their end. I don't subscribe to that. I think, Ilan Pappé, I have great respect for him. And he keeps changing it from the end to the beginning of the end. And what does the beginning of the end mean? And it could take 20, 30 years, et cetera, et cetera. So, I hope he's right, but we have to be mindful. There are political forces around the world that look at the last 2.5 or so years and go, Israel has made itself stronger, in fact. They are making that calculation. They could be wrong, but it almost doesn't matter because they're still putting their chips in the Israeli basket. I'll give you an example of that from the region, the UAE, right? The UAE has clearly made the calculation that Israeli and US plans for the region is where best to put all your money. And they're now doing it openly. They're no longer hiding it. I mean, they try to back out of this whole Netanyahu visit because that's a step too far. But, the one country that I'll believe Israel over is the UAE. I believe that Netanyahu went. I believe that they are working very closely with him, with the Israeli state, and basically saying this regional order is going to be guided by a U.S.-Israel power block, and we want to be a part of it. They're not the only ones thinking this way, so you have to be mindful of the thinking of states. Like I said, even if they're wrong in their calculations, they're making those calculations nonetheless, and they're putting their backing behind Israel. You can, like, obviously Hezbollah, Hamas are not what they used to be in terms of their military strength. They've not been completely defeated, and we view that as a victory. And rightfully so, because Israel has said, our goal is to eliminate them completely, and they've not achieved that, right? But they have degraded them. You got to be honest about that, right? Like, they have degraded their military capabilities, though they still fight them back. So it's a complex dynamic with so many global players coming into it that it's so hard to predict what's going to happen. But ultimately, I do think that because they've spent everything and didn't achieve the ultimate goal, which is the end of the Palestinian cause, that alone ensures that they will not succeed. Because today, think about it this way. Let me just reframe it this way. In October 2023, when they started to unleash this genocidal campaign, it was clear that they were like, this is it. When we're done with this, there'll be no more Palestine on people's minds, let alone in reality. It's gone. And the exact opposite has happened. Not only are literally millions and millions and millions of people around the world know more about Palestine and the Palestinian struggle, those millions not only support Palestine, those millions' political consciousness is shaped by the genocide. That means their understanding of politics in general, not just in Palestine, is being shaped by this sort of idea of the underdog that is being brutalized by this world order is finally, saying no, and enough is enough, and I'm going to speak truth to power. And they're applying that in a number of different contexts across the world, speaking to their own political causes and so on. Something like that doesn't disappear overnight. In fact, they've ensured its cementation in political consciousness of millions of people around the world for generations to come. So their goal of the final eradication of the Palestinian cause failed, gone. It will never succeed. And that is a sign of hope. When it comes to state dynamics and politics, you got to get really strategic and really sort of honest and sober in your assessment of things. Because though you and I and many people who are guided by human decency will be horrified by what we see, let's not kid ourselves. There are political and economic forces looking around and going, that's the political force that's going to make things happen for me in this region to advance my economic interests. So that's going to give them a lifeline. So that's why I keep going back to BDS. We got to take that away from them. So that's what I mean about being strategic and continuing to put pressure on your own state, wherever you are in the world, to put pressure on Israel.
Absolutely. You touched on some really important points. I'm just going to follow up with one little kind of side question, and then I'll come back to you, Professor Kamel, to just kind of round it up and end it for us. But you talked about the importance of being sober and like strategic and logical about it. Could you ever picture the West reassessing its support for the Israeli occupation entity and the usefulness of that support, given that we're saying in terms of the strategic capabilities, obviously it's the dream for Israel to be the sheriff of the region, if you will, like Trump speaks about this very openly, like the idea is for Israel to consolidate its power over this region. But ultimately, the resistance has managed to prevail itself, especially if we talk about like the Iranian dynamic changing everything with like the Strait of Hormuz, now becoming like the world economy becoming hostage to that. And like Israel is at the center of that. Like the red line for Iran that it won't budge on is the Israeli occupation entity's existence. That's the one entity it will never recognize. So if we think that Israel has become like a burden to the West in the sense that it keeps generating these crises, with Western interests now being harmed by continuing support for the entity, do you picture that strategic shift with time away from supporting it?
Excellent question. Okay, so I'll try to be quick. The reason why the U.S. Empire supports Israel the way that it does in an unconditional term across the political spectrum, Biden didn't do anything that was different than Trump, and the other way around, is the same reason why the British Empire supported in the early parts of the 20th century. Two reasons for the British Empire at the time. They didn't want European, Central and Eastern European Jewish refugees to come into the UK. It's straight up like that. They just didn't want them there. They're like, oh, put them somewhere else. Okay, send them there. Great. Number two, they were like, oh, these are going to be foreign invaders. Obviously, they understand that. Like, forget the BS of political discourse. They understand that they're bringing foreign invaders into a region that will necessarily, therefore, be hostile to them. What more of a guarantee of loyalty to your interests is there when your foreign invaders that you made possible create a state there? They owe their existence to you. They can't exist without you. They're going to be loyal to you. They can't stab you in the back ever. So it's like the best tool for an empire. And you can use them for your interest. That was why the British backed it. This is why the Americans start to back it during the Cold War, because they're like, you can't depend on the Arabs. The Arab states, even those authoritarian ones that work with us, they could turn around any moment. There could be a revolution in that state. They could take all the weapons we just sold them and turn them on us. We can't have, like, it's not reliable. That Biden, by the way, in his 1987, I think his 87 or 86 speech in Congress was basically just that. He was against the sales of weapons to the Saudi Arabia. This is where he said the famous, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. It was a session on why he thought there should be no sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia. And he said it, and he basically said what I'm just saying now. You can't rely on the Arabs the way that you can rely on Israel. Israel will never backstab us because their existence depends on us. So and therefore they will always meet our imperial interest in the region. Now, so during the Biden administration, they clearly calculated that no matter how bad this genocide is, and they understood it as a genocide, bullshit, they didn't. They thought it still is not as much. We gain more by supporting them than we lose. Trump does the same calculation. Unless there's a massive radical transformation from below in the U.S., the next president will make the same calculation because they just see the end of it is economic output for the super rich. And for them, Israel is a cash cow. You can't replace it for the military industrial complex and other financial sectors. At any rate, right? Like so that's still their calculation on the elite level, on the state level. On the people level, people in the West are starting to see, well, hold on. How is this in my interest? I'm being asked to go fight wars that don't really benefit me or any of the people around me. They may benefit the elites here, but they don't benefit me. And they benefit the Israelis more than they benefit our country as a whole. Why am I dying for this? Why are my taxpayers going for this? Why are my gas prices higher, et cetera, et cetera? This is the shift that is happening. And those people need to coalesce into a big political force to put pressure on both Democrats and Republicans to force them to change their position. And they're going to have to start to, make it so that the opposite axiom, the axiom of American politics become the opposite of what it is, which is support for Israel guarantees that you won't win, unlike what it has been as a result of the work of the Israel lobby and other forces, what it has been in the U.S. for quite some time. So I think, again, we need people power from below to put that pressure on the states to kind of recalibrate their calculations. But at this point, the U.S. still sees the reshaping of the Middle East that Israel has undertaken, and they're on board with it from the beginning under Biden, under Trump, is still their best path forward for their strategic interest in the long term, and namely its control over energy markets, not energy just as a resource, but energy markets. And Iran, and I'll finish on this, Iran has basically responded to that reality by saying, well, obviously they're going to resist with their weaponry, which is, of course, more substantial than anything Hamas and Hezbollah have. But the reason why Iran was able to bring the U.S. to the table is not because of their weaponry, is because they put economic pressure on them and on the whole global economy, which is why I keep going back to BDS. In fact, the lesson that we all should be learning from what Iran did is that economic disruption is the ultimate nuclear weapon. The Trump administration keeps going on about Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. They just said, we don't need it. They just showed they don't actually need it. They stopped the U.S. aggression with economic disruption. Obviously now the U.S. and Israel and the UAE and others are going to try to take that weapon away from Iran. But I don't think that that's going to be easy for them to do, no matter what they try. Because seems to me, barring from an occupation of Iranian lands across that coast, you're not going to be able to stop their stranglehold on that Strait of Hormuz. So economic disruption is very powerful tool. It's a powerful tool for Iran. It's powerful tool for people power. So use it, declare war on your states by threatening withdrawal of participation. Use general strikes, labor strikes. All these kinds of tools are available for people power to put pressure on powerful institutions. To then put pressure on Israel, and this is what is needed across the world, not just for the sake of the Palestinian people, but for the sake of ordinary people everywhere who don't really benefit from these economic systems that we're living under today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Ayash. You're describing turning Israel from an asset to a burden, essentially, making it so costly to maintain its existence. Yeah, absolutely. Professor Hawash, if we can get you just to end this seminar on this question, do you think Western public opinion could become more effective than the governments of the region in correcting this political imbalance that created the Nakba and the Israeli occupation entity? And what do you think about Britain in terms of it bearing this moral and ethical responsibility in correcting the imbalance that it created since the Balfour Declaration that you discussed?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some significant changes. We mustn't underestimate. When we saw MPs in the British Parliament who stood up and said, I used to be a supporter of Israel on the conservative side, not on the Labour side. No longer, I can't do that. They actually said these words in Parliament. So that is quite significant. Not huge numbers, but that's significant. Also in America, I think we haven't mentioned the Jewish community in America. I started following TikTok over the last year or so. And I cannot tell you how many videos by young Jewish Americans I saw crying and saying, because of what they'd seen. And that's where we need to bring in social media and say that it can be sort of destructive. But the vision, the videos we've seen of Israeli soldiers, committing crimes and celebrating and laughing and all of that, you see young American Jews saying, I grew up in a Zionist house. That's what they say, a Zionist home. But I can't continue to support Israel. Now, with time, that will result in a change, in my view, in Congress. It may not happen tomorrow or the day after, but the mood is that shift. What I think stands in a way against that is Christian Zionism. That there are still something like 20 million Christian Zionists around the world, particularly in America, who have not changed one bit. Yes, you have people maybe like Tucker Carlson, who has seen the light in a sense, but there aren't enough of them, particularly the really religious zealots of Christian Zionism, who will continue to support Israel. If they stop doing that, I think even in America we'll begin to see change for the better. And what we also need is for some, and I don't know where they're going to come from, but when South African apartheid ended, there was a president who began the change. Yes, under pressure, under boycotts and so on, but one man began the change. In America, in Israel, you don't see anyone. They are devoid of humanity as leaders and looking at the Palestinian people. They continue to pursue policies that not only demonize the Palestinians, but they do think they have the right to do whatever they like. But I must tell you, I laughed only once over the last year on the political side when Netanyahu said they had to occupy additional Syrian land to protect the occupied Golan. I mean, it's just laughable that an illegal act is there to protect an illegal act. So I think there is hope. Let's end with this, that yes, 78 years of the Nakba is terrible, and we Palestinians feel it all the time. Even if we're allowed to go and back to our homeland for a short visit, the treatment, the suspicion is horrendous, and we should be able to go quite easily and feel that it's our homeland. I mean, I don't know if people know that in the West Bank you don't see signs to. You don't know where you are effectively because they don't want you to know that there are Arab villages and so on. Everything's hidden. The signs don't anymore say Al-Quds. They say Yerushalayim, even in Arabic. They're trying to wipe away our identity, but the Palestinians are strong. Yes, 7 million live abroad, but they haven't forgotten. And at every opportunity, you see the amount of, first of all, attachment to Palestine. In Chile, for example, where a lot of the Palestinians in Chile left even before 1948, and they became fully integrated into the Chilean society and became ministers and what have you, but they haven't forgotten Palestine. And that's what the Zionist movement hasn't understood. When I see Jerusalem Day, which is coming up soon every year, I think to myself, last year, 77 years, and they still need an army to go into Jerusalem. I mean, it shows you that they haven't succeeded. But I agree. People who talk about 80 years and Israel will end, I don't see that. But I do think there are enough changes to give us hope as Palestinians. We make our contribution wherever we are, and we try and pressure governments. And we need to work with the people who have changed, say in the UK, when you have these numbers. And on Saturday, we have the Nakba demonstration in London on a day when there's a far-right demonstration as well. But so many people have contacted me to say, are you going? And we're going, and so on. There is still this connection with this issue because, and I'll finish on this, a lot of people not only see it as an issue about Palestine, but about freedom of speech and expression in their countries, that governments are trying to completely scupper. So you can disagree with things, but you can't say that you disagree. You know, and particularly on the Palestine issue, you criticize Israel, but only in the space that the Israelis allow. People feel, why is that happening? We should be able to speak and to express our support for the Palestinians and for other issues. So I think these are the positive changes I'm seeing and that give me hope. But at the end of the day, it is Palestinians remaining in our homeland that is the most important thing, and we must do what we can to support them in that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much, Professor Kamel Hawash and Professor Mohammed Ayash, for sharing all your great insights in this evening's webinar entitled From Nakba to Now, 78 Years of Ethnic Cleansing, Dispossession and Resistance, hosted by the Palestinian Return Center. Peace be upon all the resistant people of Palestine, struggling for the world at large, and for all those of you watching, make sure to keep up the fight. Peace and dignity with you all.
Thank you.